This is Office Hours at Duke University. Professor Neil McWilliam studies the history of making fun of presidents and kings, at least in the form of political cartoons. He is an art history professor who is interested in caricature. And this year he helped organize an exhibition of journalistic caricature called Lines of Attack at Duke's National Museum of Art. He is here to take your questions about the past, present, and future of political cartoons. Everyone watching is invited to ask Professor McWilliam a question. To do that, email live@duke.edu. You can tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and Professor McWilliam, we are here at your online office hours. Let me tell everyone watching just a few things about you. As we just mentioned, you are the guest curator for this exhibition, Lines of Attack, Conflicts and Caricature. It's on display at the National Museum of Art through May 16. You also edited the catalog for the exhibition, also called Lines of Attack. And here at Duke, you are the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of Art and Art History. So in talking about political caricature and cartoons, you had an interesting opportunity this week to get a behind-the-scenes glimpse of how a political cartoon comes together. Kevin Gallagher, a cartoonist for The Economist magazine, known as Cal, was here as part of this exhibition, and he was sketching his cartoon for the week while he was here engaged with you and others. So what was that like? And you know, we'll get a chance to see the result.
Well, that was very interesting because Cal came over to Durham on Wednesday. The previous day, Tuesday, he'd been in touch with The Economist in London and had sent them his basic idea for this week's cartoon. Wednesday morning, he got the go-ahead from the editorial offices, and so during the course of the day, he was working on the piece. He came to the National in the evening. We had a round-table discussion and then a nice long dinner, after which he had to go back to the hotel to ink in his caricature.
We should say we've got it up here.
Which we can see, which was then scanned, sent to The Economist, and appears in this week's edition. So I mean, it's an indication both of the speed with which somebody like Cal is working, and also the ways in which he's now able to rely very heavily on new technology to save him enormous amounts of time. So it's quite an interesting insight. And
when you see this final result, this caricature of the Uncle Sam negotiating with China around Iran and nuclear weapons, I mean, is there anything that comes to mind from what you've learned at the exhibit here?
Well, yes. I mean, this is classic Cal in some ways. He does like strip cartoons. He doesn't always use that format. But I think to some extent, because of the ways in which his work appears within the overall format of the magazine itself, it's a way of actually drawing attention to himself in a useful way. He's also, it's an interesting cartoon insofar as it uses national stereotypes, Uncle Sam and then the Chinese dragon, in ways that recall caricature and emblematic satire going as far back as the 17th century. So there's a real history. When we look at something like this, there's a real history of the sorts of imagery being used. It's not something which is superficial, it's very deeply rooted. The other thing is it uses wordplay. The play on the terminology that Uncle Sam uses with China. And again, this sort of use of punning is both very characteristic of Cal, but also something which is deeply embedded in the history of graphic satire itself.
Do you find, having helped organize this exhibition, that you've got new eyes when you look at political cartoons? I mean, you were looking at some at the Boston Globe this morning, New York Times. Are there ways you're breaking down cartoons that you weren't before?
Yes and no. I mean, it's something I've always been interested in, although up until recently my interest has really been historical, the 19th century in particular. I certainly look at contemporary caricature much more closely now. In putting the exhibition together, myself and the students I was working with, we had to look through literally thousands to get an idea of the sorts of themes that we were interested in highlighting, and also the artists whose work we felt was most appropriate for the exhibition. So it certainly gave us the opportunity of, if you like, sort of building up a lexicon of contemporary caricatural language. And the whole point of the exhibition, in some respects, was to take that, the contemporary perspective, and juxtapose it with the material from the 1830s
let's get into the idea of the exhibition. And so you're going back to 1830s France, and you have King Louis Philippe, and you're contrasting that mostly with Bush era cartoons. So why those two eras? What was fruitful about 1830s France?
Well, 1830s France marks the beginning of journalistic graphic satire. It's the first time, to some extent for technological reasons, that caricatures appear on the page within a magazine format. Up until then, caricature had a very rich history going back into the 18th century, mainly in England, but they were always produced as individual prints. They would be bought singly. 1830s France marks a real change, a sea change in that regard. And my thinking behind the exhibition when it was first mooted was that this formed a very interesting parallel, because you have the period which sees the beginning of journalistic caricature. And then looking at what's going on today, because of technological changes, because of economic pressures, in many regards, I think we're coming to the end of that tradition. Caricature on the printed page, as opposed to caricature in some other form, either digital or animated. So thinking about, if you like, the beginnings of this 170-year history, and what looks as if it might be, if not its absolute end, at least its swan song, seemed like a good opportunity to ask people to take caricature as a medium seriously, and to think, when confronted by these two different periods, about the ways in which the language of graphic satire had developed, the effect that it can have, and the sorts of constraints that practitioners were working under, both in the 1830s, and there are other different constraints that they find themselves facing today. So there were lots of different things that suggested fruitful parallels and fruitful contrasts.
Right, and you've started to speak about the technology story here. I guess it's lithography that emerges in the 19th century, and then of course now this thing called the internet. So what are parallels, contrasts, comparisons that you make the way that the art is affected by the technology and vice versa?
Well, you see, it's because of lithography that it's possible to integrate caricature into journals. Prior to that, caricatures had primarily been engravings produced on copper plate, which was impossible to integrate into a bigger journalistic format, and also impossible to produce in anything like the sorts of numbers that were needed, because the plates would wear down so quickly. Lithography is then invented in 1798, and it's relatively soon that it becomes clear that it allows a much more flexible integration of image and text. And the two publications that are highlighted in the Nesher exhibition, La Caricature, which is set up in 1830 and runs to 1835, and the daily Le Charivari, which is set up in 1832 and lasts until I think it's 1936, both take advantage of this new technology. It's cumbersome because it involves having to print the journal twice. Both journals are essentially a single sheet of paper, which is printed back and front and then folded into four. But it's printed twice insofar as, first of all, the letterpress goes through, printing pages 1, 2, and 4, and then it's printed on a lithographic press to imprint the image on page 3. So it's cumbersome, but at least it's doable, and it's doable in large numbers. Lithographic plates are inexhaustible, so they can produce large numbers. And again, you know, the internet, a massive communications revolution, which, you know, in some ways it represents a great threat to the caricaturist, as people are unfortunately abandoning the daily newspaper, the printed daily newspaper, for other formats. But equally, it represents great opportunities as well. And actually, Cal, The Economist, has been one of the people who've been in the forefront of thinking about the ways in which new digital technologies allow animation to be added to caricature in really exciting and innovative ways.
And before we leave 1830s France, I think there's a fun story to tell here about the artist and editor Charles Philippon, who he gets in trouble. He is charged with violating the dignity of the crown when he does a sketch of King Louis Philippe, and he goes to trial, and then he tries to sort of draw himself out of trouble. Yeah, tell the story, because I think it's illustrative of the occupation and the kind of character of these artists.
Well, when Louis Philippe came to power in 1830, he promised to uphold freedom of the press, and this was a promise which was quickly abandoned. La caricature, when it's set up, becomes increasingly critical of the king. And in 1831, Philippon publishes a caricature which shows the king as a worker holding a trowel with which he's replastering a wall. On the wall itself are the slogans from the revolution which had brought him to power in July 1830, promising freedom, promising different benefits from the new regime, which he's trying to eradicate. The authorities took exception to this because they felt that it was calling the king's person into disrepute. And so Philippon was brought before the courts. In court, he argued, rather unconvincingly, that the figure was not meant to represent the king, but was meant to represent the government. And in order to defend himself, he said, well, look, you know, any object can be misconstrued in such a way. He says, you know, let me just show you. And so he starts to draw a portrait of the king in pen, which he then transforms in 3 subsequent drawings into the figure of a pear. He says, look, you know, a pear fortuitously looks like the king. Does that mean that every time we see a pear, it's an example of lèse-majesté, an example of disrespect? He, of course, loses his case. He's actually imprisoned for 7 months as a result.
So there's a lesson here. Don't try and comic strip your way out of a
It didn't work for him,
right.
yeah. But the pear has enormous potential in terms of its caricatural fortunes during the 1830s, particularly since la poire, the word itself, means fathead or idiot in French slang. So the caricaturists who are working at La Caricature immediately take up the figure of the pear as a means of commenting on indirectly on the king and showing the king in the most ridiculous situations, all the while pretending that this is an entirely innocent exercise. So it really does, and it becomes one of the great moments, I think, in the history of European caricature. The pear itself is an absolutely classic emblem, and is still recognised as one of the great achievements of the campaign against Louis Philippe in the 1830s.
Good. We've got a question here that's come in by Twitter, and everyone who's watching is invited to ask Professor McWilliam a question. You can do that by email, live@duke.edu. You can tweet in a question with the tag Duke Live, or post one on the Duke University Facebook page. This one comes from Nasher Girl, who asked, hi, Professor McWilliam, do most contemporary cartoonists know about Henri Daumier from the 19th century?
I would imagine that for most contemporary cartoonists, Daumier remains a hero. In fact, Cal, when he began his remarks on Wednesday, thanked Daumier, because we do have quite a lot of Daumier's work in the exhibition. He was drawing attention to that and was saying just how seminal an influence Daumier's work was upon him. And Daumier is a towering figure in terms of 19th century caricature. And both Daumier, but also the artists who are working in the journal at the same time as him, really do lay many of the foundations for the modern language of caricature. So he's a phenomenally important figure.
Good. In talking about this language of caricature, some of these French 19th century caricatures, they're not easy to get for the amateur, but some of them, it does jump out. So in seeing the exhibition myself, Lady Liberty shows up, and that's obvious. I mean, the French gave us the Statue of Liberty, and so that image is easy for someone to grasp today. So what about this language of caricature? What are examples of that you can see in the exhibition?
Well, I think the first thing that's important to say is that caricature, as we see it in the exhibition in the 19th century and as we understand it today, has a prehistory going back into the 17th century, where satirical imagery was mainly made up of emblems. So figures like liberty or justice or fortune, drawn from the long-standing tradition of using emblems in allegorical works of art. These original satirical images were not particularly caricatural. It's only during the 18th century, really, particularly in England, that you see a shift away from this emblematic language to one which places much more emphasis on the individual people who are being mocked and uses facial distortion, physical distortion, as a way of adding that element of humour. So we get, if you like, a sort of a remnant of the earlier tradition in the survival of emblems like Liberty, who still populate caricature even today. Uncle Sam would be an instance of that, although he's only somebody who comes into being in the 19th century. But we do have, I think, still a very sort of hybrid language. We talk about caricature, which emphasizes the notion of facial exaggeration, of graphic exaggeration as a whole, but there are still other elements which feed into the ways in which political satire works.
In any insight, I mean, the obvious elements that jump out are the words, the captions, and then the visual, the drawing, the caricature. So any insights about how those interplay? Do some artists start with the words and go for the image, or vice versa? How do they develop?
That's hard to say. I mean, I think one of the things that one does see, and it's visible in the exhibition to some extent, is the way in which occasionally a caricaturist feels the need to pin down a particular element in an image so it will be labelled. We were looking earlier today, for example, at an image of Ben Bernanke giving a news conference, and he's standing inside a huge open mouth with teeth descending down on all sides around him, which he seems to be oblivious of, and it's labelled deficit.
Right.
In and of itself, the mouth is meaningless. It needs that label. And it's not a proper emblem either. It's just being used entirely fortuitously. But it needs that in order for it to be meaningful. That is not always the most successful way of producing a caricature. You can overburden an image with these little sort of insistently produced ingredients. It's much better, I think, if a cartoon is punchy, is sharp, and is immediately comprehensible to the viewer in visual terms. And I think if we look at Peter Cooper's work, for example, Cooper produced an image for the New York Times based upon the notorious figure of the hooded internee in Abu Ghraib, and shows the electrodes attached to his fingers going back by cable to the White House itself. This makes it doesn't need a caption, it doesn't need any particular labeling, it makes its point absolutely pointedly, it makes it very pungently, very precisely, and leaves the viewer in no doubt as to the cartoonist's opinion and where he believes blame lies. It was such an effective piece of work, in fact, the New York Times refused to actually run it. So I think, in a sense, it shows very effectively just how effective cartooning can still be.
In talking about that judgment, I mean, the point of these is to be provocative, but you're saying that the Times chose not to run it. There's the famous case of the Danish paper back in 2005, ran the caricatures of Mohammed. They did decide to run those, and it caused a little stir and some violence around the world. So
more than a little stir.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, there were literally hundreds of people killed. Yeah, I mean, that's rather different. The Jyllands-Posten in Denmark deliberately decided that they would run a series of cartoons of Mohammed in order to challenge what they saw as an unjustified infringement on their freedom because of the Islamic interdiction of portraying the Prophet. It was, I think, a somewhat provocative gesture, which backfired in a rather spectacular way. And while one might feel sympathetic to their desire to uphold free speech, and particularly not to be intimidated by religious fanaticism, at the same time, I think in a case like that, it is incumbent on editors to think about the long-term effects that their decisions are going to have.
Are there any lines you can draw? And now I'm thinking of the New Yorker cover a couple of years back. They had President Obama in Muslim garb, Michelle Obama in a sort of a terrorist get-up with a gun. They ran it. It caused some controversy. There wasn't the violent reaction. You know, in hindsight, was that the best thing to do? I mean, is there any kind of guidance, advice you can give about that's provocative, that's in bad taste?
I don't think it's either provocative or in bad taste. I mean, it was produced by somebody who I think is one of the very best cartoonists working in the States at the moment, Barry Blitz, who produces an image for the New York Times every Sunday. His work always illustrates Frank Rich's column. I thought it was a surprisingly ham-fisted image, insofar as it lacked the frame which would make sense of it, because he wasn't saying Obama is really a terrorist. He was making fun of some of the more outlandish claims coming from the right, that Obama was indeed a terrorist or a Muslim or whatever, and the whole business about the terrorist bump. But the way in which the cartoon was framed, or lacked a proper sort of distancing, made it look as if that supplementary level of irony was simply not there. And it led, quite understandably in some respects, to rather crude misreadings. And the New Yorker ended up in hot water, and I think Barry probably wished he'd not done it as well. I mean, it was one of the sort of first instances in which the whole issue of having to caricature a black president was brought to the fore. And
you've been keeping an eye on that, about how the development of the caricature of President Obama, we're a little over a year into his presidency. What have you seen with that issue?
Well, I mean, there have been instances where somewhat unwise imagery was run. The New York Post, for example, ran a caricature by the resident caricaturist Sean Delonis at the time of the debates around the stimulus. And it didn't actually show President Obama, but there was this strange case at the time of a monkey that was on the loose in Connecticut, I think it was, and had been shot by the police. And he used that as an analogy to the stimulus bill. And people, quite understandably, felt that he was making some inappropriate sort of racial slur, and that landed him in hot water. Since then, I think caricaturists have been a little chary. They've been rather conscious of the difficulties they might find themselves in. And I think it's quite striking if you look at the way in which the imagery of President Obama has developed. It's really not that much different from his predecessors. There's been a very, I think, careful effort being made by most caricaturists to avoid the sorts of faux pas that Delonis made.
Yeah, so in talking about political cartoons, there's the cartoon, then there's all the politics involved, and I think an interesting way to get at that is in this Nasher exhibition, there's a free speech booth, and so people can come up and record a quick video of their reaction to the exhibition, and then that then gets posted on YouTube on the National Museum website. Now, you might have seen this one. There's a fun one by a little boy who's maybe about 10 years old, and he asks a question that I'm going to throw to you now. And this anonymous boy said, "Why was it only criticizing George Bush?" So are artists all leftists? And no, okay.
No, there are several things to be said. One is it's not critical of George Bush. It's not critical of anybody. It's about caricature. Okay. Secondly, I mean, our choice. I initially simply wanted to run Louis-Philippe and George Bush because I thought there would be a neatness in having these two figures who ran as a theme throughout the exhibition. It would be easier for people, in a sense, to see the point because there would be no distractions. We decided at certain points it would be useful, and I think it was a good decision, actually, to include imagery of Bill Clinton. And so there are, I think, about half a dozen caricatures from the Clinton administration. One of the things it highlights, I think, is the way in which cartoonists are basically sort of equal opportunity when it comes to attacking politicians. That there isn't any particular sort of axe to grind, which means that particular administrations get a free pass. It's simply not the case. Also, I mean, clearly, we were rather conscious right from the get-go that there would be some people who would have problems with the decision to place such a spotlight on a recently serving president. But it wouldn't have made much sense to have chosen Grover Cleveland or James Polk. It needed to be topical. It needed to be comprehensible. As you say, the historical caricature is relatively speaking hard work because by and large viewers are not familiar with the figures themselves, and the graphic language is much more involved. By contrast, the material that we highlight from the period 2000-2008, the events are familiar, the political actors are familiar, the graphic language is much more accessible. And it is meaningful. And I think that's what makes the exhibition a valuable exercise, because it does, if it offends people, and I'm sure it will in certain instances, that's a good thing, because they need to think about, well, they talk about free speech. This is an instance of that. They need to think about the ways in which caricature works and how particular politicians figure within the media economy overall. One thing I would say, in addition, though, is that we did try rather hard to get a number of caricaturists who tend to be rather more critical of liberal positions and were rather more generous towards George Bush than some of the ones who were on the walls.
And who would they be? I guess those names don't...
I don't know if it's a good idea to talk about them, because these are people who didn't want to participate in the exhibition.
Oh, okay.
And so there was no desire on our part to represent one particular point of view. There was a real effort made to try and get as broad, because from a purely academic point of view, I think it's interesting to see as broad a spectrum as possible. But we were not as successful there as I would have liked.
And talking about bringing this exhibition together, you worked with a group of students to do that. So I'm wondering what that was like, and maybe what perspectives that they brought that were helpful, fresh.
They were great. They were incredibly hardworking. I said to them at the very outset that taking on this job was going to mean a commitment which went way beyond the work we actually did in class. And so they were working with me in total for about 15, 16 months. And both in terms of just the sort of sheer donkey work of going through newspapers, magazines, websites to get a comprehensive overview of production of caricature in this country and in Britain. And also in terms of the sort of intellectual input that they provided, they were fantastic. They were really, really good. And if I could do the same thing again next semester, I would do it, because it's a great way of teaching. And I think it's also something which gives very valuable experience to people who may want to go into curatorial positions in the long term themselves.
Right, that makes sense. And this exhibition, of course, it's got history of caricature and making the comparison with the 1830s in France. It also gestures at the future of caricature. I mean, there's the digital exhibitions in there. So when you look at the cutting edge now of caricature, who are names or sort of styles that you think of?
Well, we have some of the material in the exhibition. Jib Jab is a site which I'm sure everybody knows, and which has some extremely funny and very smart political parodies. I mean, some of the things they've done using parodies of songs, popular songs, I think are quite brilliant. They don't use caricature though. They use sort of photo montages, animations. It's not drawn. And that's one of the areas where I think that we are going to see a change, that as digital technologies, in a sense, eclipse the traditional caricaturist's art, which is a graphic art, then caricaturists are increasingly going to be using online resources, digital resources, rather than pen and ink, which I think is a great change. There are some wonderful caricaturists in the exhibition who are great graphic artists. Somebody like Edward Sorrell, for example, is somebody of enormous talent as a graphic artist in his own right. Steve Brodner, and in England, artists like Steve Bell. These are people who are visually interesting, and it would be a great shame if that element in the history of graphic satire was to be lost. New things will emerge, and again, Cal was showing us things on Wednesday which point in very interesting and exciting new directions. But it's I think, a little bit of a risk that the internet becomes the be-all and end-all, and what we end up with is in a sense just a form of a new form of cartooning, like sort of Bugs Bunny, but with President Obama's ears rather than Bugs Bunny's.
And do you get into the money aspect at all? Like, how can an artist make a living by throwing things up on the web?
Yeah, this is a big problem. This is a big problem, I think. It's a problem which goes hand in hand with the bigger question of how newspapers and magazines can establish a financially viable web presence.
And your colleague James Hamilton was part of that discussion
yes,
about newspaper
absolutely.
business here too.
And I think that this is one of caricaturists at the moment are suffering a huge wave of unemployment because of the difficulties that traditional media are facing. I mean, we mentioned at the very outset of the exhibition that in 2009, 40 caricaturists lost their jobs in this country alone. And as newspapers close, or as newspapers in certain instances become web-only publications, this is going to have a real effect on the future of graphic satire in its most traditional forms. But as I say, I think there are new avenues opening up, and there are obviously ones which some of the more far-sighted caricaturists are really sort of meeting halfway.
In talking about new forms, there's something of a genre that I've seen, and it's not always intentional, but it's the YouTube clip. I mean, it's the Howard Dean scream, it's the Jeremiah Wright sermon, George Allen in Virginia. There's a quick little soundbite of him repeating what was later called a slur, and it has a huge political implication, and it's sometimes just an amateur grabs this, posts it on YouTube, and then it goes around. I mean, what about that sort of, I guess, guerrilla video caricature?
There's that. I mean, I think what comes closer to what we've been talking about, in a sense, are attempts by non-professionals to produce animations of their own, which end up on YouTube. Some of them are very good, but I think one of the misgivings I've had in looking at a lot of the material that ends up in that sort of format is that, number one, it tends to be politically rather poorly informed. It's hey, look at President Bush, he's funny, he's got big ears. Or it tends to be graphically not very interesting. So you have 30 seconds of somebody moving to no great effect and then delivering a punchline. So it might just as well have been a single graphic image, a still image, rather than animation. There's nothing particularly animated about a lot of the material that gets produced.
Right.
But I think, having said that, this idea that, this opens up a whole new area to people who before have not had that opportunity of making their opinions known and their talents known. This is a wonderful thing, obviously.
Everyone watching is invited to ask Professor McWilliam a question about political cartoons. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in a question with the tag Duke Live, or post one on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor McWilliam, I think it's going to be hard to leave a discussion of political cartoons without mentioning Gary Trudeau, the Doonesbury strip that is so recognizable today in contemporary political cartoon. But in a way, he breaks some of the molds. I mean, sometimes there's no faces. Sometimes there's even no people in his sketches. So, can you talk about what his work does with the genre? Sometimes it's an ongoing soap opera. It's not a quick little punchline. So where does he fall in this world?
Well, Gary Trudeau, I think, is a quite remarkable figure and a national institution, insofar as he has created his own world, which, as you say, has storylines which will last for weeks and characters with whom one becomes familiar over a matter of years. A lot of the time, it's not political satire in the most direct form. It can be quite elusive. Although when he has taken on politicians, notably George W. Bush in his early years in the White House and during the Iraq War, he can be extremely potent, extremely punchy, and he approaches the whole issue of political caricature, I think, in a very sort of off-beam way. As you said, when George Bush first emerged, I think, as a candidate, he was shown simply as an empty Stetson. There was nobody under the hat. Once the Iraq War started, he was turned into a Centurion's helmet. So there's this, I think there's this sort of dripping contempt, which he manages to actually sort of conceal by this very light, very sort of affecting graphic style and this wonderful range of characters that he's elaborated over the years.
And what about this tension where you're working in cartoons, which is you know, an entertainment medium, but you're talking about serious issues, and you know, war, life and death, a whole administration. I'm thinking of the Iraq Piata. That's one of the images I'll show up here. What about this tension between the seriousness and the playfulness of these cartoons? How does that come out? And this is Pat Oliphant.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that it's important to recognize is that cartoons aren't merely funny. They're not simply going for a laugh. Oliphant you have, but in the same opening, Peter Cooper's parody of René Magritte's This Is Not a Pipe. You know, both of these make profoundly serious points, and they do so in a rather careful, a rather respectful way, that we have the sort of rather inadequate figure of George Bush as this sort of tiny little man with the huge hat, but he's juxtaposed with this extraordinarily moving figure of the dying soldier. This is not something which is flippant. It's not something which is done light-heartedly. It's done, I think, to try and stimulate some sort of both emotional and intellectual response in the part of the viewer. He's trying to sow a seed of consciousness.
Very good. And now, of course, you approach this as a scholar, not as a caricaturist yourself. And Duke's got a collection here of cartoons going back in history. What are you looking for as a scholar when you look back to cartoons? I mean, you're not just looking for the funniest ones. You're looking for hints about culture, hints about politics. So what's that process of looking through a collection?
Well, here at Duke, we are extraordinarily lucky. We have a very substantial collection of satirical journals dating back to the 1820s and going down to the 1930s, 1940s. It's, I think, probably one of the biggest in the country, and ranges very wide geographically as well. I know we're just about to buy a Swedish journal from the 1930s, but we have a material from Turkey. We have a huge collection from South America, and an excellent collection of French material as well. You're right. I mean, you know, this is not just about sort of sitting around in a seminar room laughing. It's not a question of trying to see, you know, who is the funniest cartoonist of the 1870s. Right. Graphic satire is an extraordinary way of thinking about political discourse in particular historical periods. I think for art historians who are particularly invested in, if you like, historical investigation, politically interested in the past, then these are a particularly useful way of thinking about not opinion, because I think this is one of the sort of misunderstandings that we occasionally encounter. That, you know, these do not tell us what public opinion was like at a particular period. They do tell us about the ways in which particular institutions wish to influence opinion, and may well have actually had quite a ready response amongst those people who are reading particular journals, buying particular prints. So it gives us a window into the past, but one which we need to approach very cautiously. We can't simply say, this is what it was like, this is what people were thinking. It also allows us to think about popular mentalities and popular culture in terms of the sorts of imagery which cartoonists feel it's appropriate to use at any particular moment, the sorts of emblems that we were talking about earlier on, the Uncle Sams, Britannias, figures of liberty, this, that and the other. How do these get integrated into graphic languages, and how do cartoonists also draw from more sort of vernacular cultures as well, from the culture of everyday life? How is that used and exploited, as we can see actually in the exhibition? The way in which Louis Philippe is shown as a sort of prosaic bourgeois figure. How does that sort of lifestyle signify in these cartoons? What is its polemical effect? So they demand very, very intense reading, I think. The other thing as well is when you start to look at the journals in which these things appear, it is necessary to think about the relationship between image and text, and the bigger context in which these individual political caricatures are being published.
Good. We've got a question that's come in here by email from Stuart, and everyone watching is invited to ask Professor McWilliam a question. You can do that by email, live@duke.edu, by Twitter with the tag Duke Live, or posting a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. We've got 64 people participating in office hours here, and Stuart asks, Professor McWilliam, do you think we'll see citizen cartoonists try to fill some of the gaps left by newspaper layoffs, given how effective cartoons are in public policy debate?
Yeah, I mean, the way in which the web allows people not simply to produce cartoons, but to produce their own blogs, their own, effectively a sort of a substitute form of newspaper online, this all provides a forum, a new forum, and in some ways a much more flexible, a much more responsive forum in which the cartoonist can certainly find a place. So yes, I think the future, we're simply sitting on the edge, I think, at the moment, of a really quite radical change in the way in which we interact with the political and social world as a whole, and the internet is really a remarkable tool in facilitating the exchange of opinion, in which caricature, as I say, possibly in a somewhat different form, but caricature will definitely find a place.
Good. We're coming up on the end of the office hour here, but so as we wrap up here, what about just a little tip for somebody who's online right now, poking around and might want to get a glimpse of either just really good caricature, just the craft well done, or else you know, the future. I mean, you mentioned the Jib Jab site, other places to look online, and just, or where do you like to go when you know you're taking a break from your research and you want to get some entertainment? Where do you go online?
Well, there are an awful lot of websites now which have caricature on them. Let me just mention my favourite caricaturist, the British caricaturist Steve Bell, who works for The Guardian in London. Both he and Martin Rowson, who also is an extraordinarily good caricaturist. Their work can be seen on The Guardian's website, and they're archived going back several years. But in terms of more general selection, sites like salon.com, actually, if you go to their caricatures, once you start looking, there are literally thousands of these which have been archived. And then various sites of syndicated cartoons. Darrell Cagle, for example, his site is extremely full. The Boston Globe and the New York Times also are ways of finding caricatures, which again are generally stored for many months. So you can get a very, very, and this was invaluable to us, obviously, in putting the exhibition together. You can get a very good overview of the ways in which particular themes have played out in caricature over a matter of months, if not years.
Very good. Well, Professor McWilliam, you've given us a great overview here and some good web surfing assignments here. And everyone who wants to learn more about the Nasher Lines of Attack exhibition can go to the website nasher.duke.edu. The exhibition runs through May 16. A recording of this online office hours session is on the Duke On Demand website, along with many other Duke videos, and that's ondemand.duke.edu. Return here to the Duke Ustream channel this afternoon at 3:30 Eastern Time for a conversation with Duke alumni in the entertainment business. Then at 7 p.m. today, the Duke Fuqua School of Business has its Startup Challenge that will be streamed here on the Duke Ustream site with a keynote address by Mint.com CEO Aaron Patzer. Finally, next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. is a Duke Reads conversation with Dean Steve Nowicki on Ann Patchett's book, Bel Canto. As always, to learn more about Duke, you can visit duke.edu.